Some men leave. These men made their wife disappear. She broke the rules, so they broke her. No begging, no mercy, just silence. They didn't snap. They decided. And when they acted, it wasn't love anymore. It was punishment. These are 5 of the most ruthless serial killers in the US. Men who didn't just feel betrayed. They turned love into a weapon and used it to kill the women who crossed them. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if you want more disturbing serial killer cases like these, don't forget to subscribe. Because these cases weren't crimes of passion, they were punishments planned in silence. Micah Thorne looked like someone who always held the door open. He had a bank teller's politeness, the kind of man who said ma'am at the grocery store and sent thank you cards when someone brought him a pie. In Pine Ridge, Arkansas, everyone knew Micah as the church handyman, fixed the lights, swept the porch, changed the air filters. No one thought twice when he offered to drive widows to Sunday service or stayed late to repaint the chapel steps. But the quiet ones aren't always harmless. Micah's obsession didn't begin with hate. It began with humiliation. His wife, Jessamine, had left him after 11 years of marriage. No fight, no final scream. Just a note that said, "I'm tired of feeling invisible," and the sound of her SUV leaving the gravel driveway. She moved 2 counties over, took a bookkeeping job, dyed her hair red, and started dating a man named Cody, who wore boots with his jeans and posted gym selfies on Facebook. Micah saw every one of them. He created a burner account, started following Jessamine's new life, logging each post in a folder titled Slut Proof. In public, he kept smiling. In private, he began constructing a plan, not out of rage, but out of the belief that she'd robbed him of dignity. His method began with a disguise. Using leftover insulation foam, mesh tape, and prosthetic glue, Micah constructed a full silicone mask, thinning his nose, arching his brows, darkening his skin tone with tanner from a Halloween kit. He purchased a used gray Ford Ranger from a private seller on Craigslist using an old friend's ID and drove it only at night, never refueling near town. His first step was surveillance. Every Thursday, Jessamine visited a specific car wash, self-serve, poorly lit, no cameras, usually after picking up groceries. Micah waited 2 months to strike. On October 10th, 1997, he parked beside the vacuum station, masked and gloved, and waited until she exited her car to clean the back seat. The weapon was quiet, a hypodermic needle filled with succinylcholine, a paralytic that doesn't stop the heart, just locks the muscles. She collapsed mid-reach. Micah dragged her into the Ranger, covered her with moving blankets, and drove 4 hours northeast toward Ozark National Forest. He never exceeded the speed limit. The disposal site was a root cellar built during the 1930s, abandoned, caved in on one side, and invisible unless you were standing on it. Micah had reinforced it 2 weeks prior with wood beams and installed a drain at the base that led into limestone runoff. He laid her body on a steel gurney. No chains, no panic, just surgical efficiency. He removed the teeth with locking pliers, shaved the fingertips, and ran her hair through an old mulching attachment to destroy the follicles. Over the next 6 hours, he soaked the body in a corrosive solution made from lye, potassium hydroxide, and boiling water. Every organ was broken down into viscous sludge, flushed through the gravel bed beneath the cellar. Bones were pulverized manually and then reduced further using a borrowed cement mixer filled with bleach and sand. Micah wore double nitrile gloves under dishwashing gloves and placed all waste, including gloves, clothing, and tools, into a burn barrel 50 yards west of the cellar. He started the fire with diesel-soaked rags and stayed to stir the ashes. By morning, there was no blood, no bone, no DNA. The only thing left was a belt buckle, engraved with the letter J, which he buried 3 feet beneath a decoy fire pit. By 10 a.m., he was back home, having already sent a forged email from Jessamine's account to her workplace. Taking some personal time, Don't worry. The IP was routed through a proxy. The laptop used was stolen from a motel dumpster and later thrown off a bridge. When the police did come knocking, 2 weeks later, Micah answered the door in slippers, holding a mug that read, "World's okayest husband." He cried on cue, said she left him once before, that she had demons, that he prayed for her return every night. The detective noted his hands, smooth, clean, pink under the nails, no calluses, no cuts, no reason to doubt. But what no one knew was this: Jessamine wasn't his first. She was just the first the police would come looking for. Because 2 years earlier, in 1995, a waitress named Rochelle Harper had also disappeared, last seen leaving a potluck where Micah had fixed the wiring. And in both cases, no body was ever found, no final texts, no blood. Just a quiet man in work boots who knew how to vanish evidence one molecule at a time. Micah didn't see these acts as crimes. He called them reversals. In his mind, these women had rewritten the rules, walked away from contracts, shamed him without confrontation. So he rewrote their endings, not with a gun or a knife, but with bleach, compression, and time. That's why Jessamine's file sat cold for 14 years. No suspects, no charges, just a missing woman and a town that whispered maybe she just snapped. It wasn't until a forestry crew stumbled on melted PVC fragments and partially burned pliers in 2011 that the case reopened. But by then, Micah was gone. New name, new town, new church, and a new woman, of course. This one a Sunday school teacher with a bad knee and no family. Her name was Darlene. She disappeared in 2014. The Jessamine Carter disappearance was cold for nearly 5 years. No movement, no body, no digital echo. But in 1997, a break came not from forensics, but from pattern. Another woman, Darlene Finch, vanished after attending a counseling group for emotionally abused spouses. Her car was found parked 2 blocks from the library. No signs of struggle. The ignition was cold. The doors were locked from the outside. Darlene had been rebuilding her life after leaving a high-control marriage. The only constant in her recent schedule was the Tuesday night support group, and the only male present at all 6 of her sessions had been a quiet man with silver hair, soft voice, and no last name listed on the roster. He called himself M.E., and nobody ever asked more. The police didn't connect the dots until a tip came from a former support group attendee who noticed that M.E. always took a side seat, never shared, and once corrected someone about a legal term used in a conversation about restraining orders. The details stuck. They pulled records, found a short-lived court case involving Jessamine Carter's mother requesting access to her daughter's storage unit. A unit that had been paid for 6 months in advance by a Micah Ellison. The name hadn't surfaced before, but now it mattered. Detectives quietly accessed the storage space. It was clean, empty, but they recovered 2 items, a gardening spade with worn rubber grip and a canvas satchel with faded initials JC in embroidery thread. Inside was nothing but a melted candle stub, a safety pin, and a clipping of blonde hair sealed in a glassine envelope. Forensics revealed the hair had been cut post-mortem. Nearby soil in the spade's crevices matched chemical traces found beneath Darlene Finch's car: crushed limestone, rust flakes, and an uncommon compound used in sealing basement walls. When they raided Micah's home, they found a basement utility room with modified drainage and insulation stripped from one section of wall, a spot slightly wider than the others. Under UV, faint blood protein markers glowed across the concrete, enough for a warrant. In a garden patch behind the house, they dug through what had once been a compost area. Beneath the second layer of soil, forensic teams unearthed fragments of a charred diary, dental crowns, and plastic traces from a phone case model last sold in 1992, the same year Jessamine vanished. That was enough to put Micah Ellison on trial. but it wasn't enough to convict without a confession. What they got instead was a monologue. In an unguarded moment during an evaluation, Micah said, "People always assume the hardest part is the kill. It's not. It's making her mean nothing afterward. That's what gives you peace." He saw it as deletion, not murder, not rage, just quiet reclamation of emotional power. He was sentenced to life without parole after DNA on the diary paper matched Jessamine's blood. Darlene Finch's body was never recovered, but her disappearance was classified as presumed homicide based on circumstantial and geographic consistency. Micah died in prison 6 years later from pancreatic cancer. He left behind a single drawing in his cell, an empty birdcage, shaded in pencil with no door, no note, just that. The Jessamine case remained one of the few where emotional manipulation, stalking, and erasure aligned so tightly it read like fiction. But Micah wasn't alone. There was another man, different state, different method, but the same obsession with betrayal. Only this one wasn't methodical. He was messy, emotional, loud in his silence, and his story unraveled with blood and blue thread. The first killer left no fingerprints, only silence. But if he was the ghost in the walls, this next one was the seamstress of grief. His name was Derek Holloway, and by every outward glance, he stitched his life back together after the divorce, attending therapy, volunteering at a local thrift co-op, even remarrying 2 years after being left by his high school sweetheart. But no one saw the thread he pulled taut in secret, a plan so tightly wound it didn't snap for years. Derek was 42 when his first wife, Natalie, ended their marriage. They'd been together since prom night 1978, back when Derek still made mixtapes and Natalie wore tube socks over leggings. But love, as Derek saw it, wasn't just romance. It was ownership. Natalie didn't leave because of violence or infidelity. She left because Derek never forgave. Every time she stayed late at the art studio, every glance at a male colleague, Derek logged it, not in arguments, not in outbursts, in notebooks. She called it quiet judgment. He called it structure. When she moved out, she offered mediation. He declined. When she offered friendship, he smiled and nodded. And when she married a gentle widower named Colin Westwood 6 years later, Derek sent a handwritten card. Congratulations on finally finding peace. What Natalie didn't know, what no one knew, was that Derek had begun rehearsing a fantasy 2 years earlier. It began as a journal entry. Then, rough sketches. A mannequin dressed like Natalie, simulated arguments, rope tension practice on a dress form. He wasn't planning a confrontation. He was planning an erasure. But his methods were unlike anything the coroner had ever documented. Derek's work at the co-op gave him access to discarded sewing machines, bolt cutters, upholstery thread, mannequins, and most importantly, space. The staff called him Mr. Fix-It. They left him alone in the back room where he cataloged every donated item. Over 2 years, he built what he jokingly called the tailor's coffin. A collapsible frame lined with burlap and embedded with dozens of curved sewing needles on springs, rigged with a pulley system that mimicked a fainting couch when triggered. The mechanism didn't kill, it immobilized. It caused internal bleeding without puncturing the skin. The actual kill came later. But Natalie wasn't the only one. Between 1993 and 1998, 3 women connected to Derek disappeared within 90 days of renewed contact. Each of them passed flames, each of them having recently forgiven Derek after years of estrangement. That was his lure. He waited, always in control, until they reached out for closure, apology, or coffee. Then he offered healing. Every woman he killed believed they were repairing something. And that was the point. His second victim, Denise Mallory, was a former tenant from when Derek owned a rental duplex in Dayton, Ohio. She had sued him for illegal eviction in 1992 after refusing his advances. He lost the case. Years later, when they bumped into each other at a grocery store, Derek apologized. They had coffee. She forgave him. 3 weeks later, she vanished. Her apartment door was locked. Her purse was inside. Her mail was stacked neatly. Police assumed she'd left voluntarily. Her car was later found parked behind a consignment shop Derek used to supply with bolts of fabric. Investigators missed it. There were no cameras in the alley. Derek's disposal method wasn't quick. It was layered, like a pattern stitched across months. He didn't bury, he repurposed. Each victim's clothing was incinerated in a steel drum behind the co-op, under the guise of damaged goods disposal. Body fluids were absorbed by thrifted mattress foam, later donated to local shelters after chemical sterilization. The bodies themselves, or what remained, were never found whole. Derek dismantled in segments. He froze limbs using donated meat lockers, then inserted them into concrete-filled vintage trunks, which he sold to antique dealers out of state. One trunk was found in rural Kentucky in 2015, sold as a decorative piece to a wedding venue. Inside, bone fragments embedded in cement and rusted upholstery tacks. It matched the disposal signature found years later in a second-hand auction house in Michigan. But by then, Derek was gone. His killings escalated in 1998 when Natalie reconnected after her husband died of a stroke. They exchanged letters. He brought her tea. The third visit was dinner. That night, she disappeared. Her keys were found in her locked car. Derek claimed she never came over. But a neighbor saw a woman in a red raincoat, Natalie's favorite, entering his house around 7 p.m. She was never seen again. Police found no signs of struggle. Derek had repainted the guest room. The carpet was replaced due to wine stains, he said. But what they didn't notice was the faint trace of protein and rust on the pulley beam above the old sewing cabinet, and the burlap fibers left behind on the drain in the laundry sink. When questioned, Derek maintained calm. Too calm. He explained everything. The paint, the carpet, the raincoat. She wore one like that in college, he smiled. But I haven't seen her in years. Police searched the co-op, but found nothing. The tailor's coffin had already been disassembled. The mannequin burned. The sewing tools replaced. What they didn't realize was that Derek kept only one item from each woman, a single thread-wrapped finger bone, sealed inside a padded envelope, buried beneath a row of hostas in his garden. He called them tokens of silence. In 2003, the truth began to leak, literally. Heavy rains caused a flood in the co-op's sub-basement. A drainage pipe collapsed. Maintenance workers found 3 crates filled with water-damaged garments and 1 rusted metal box containing a severed foot embedded in dry cleaning wrapped in an old receipt from 1995. DNA matched Denise Mallory. Derek was arrested 6 weeks later at a retirement center where he taught quilting. He said only one thing: the pattern's finished. In court, prosecutors presented forensic textile evidence, soil matched to decomposed calcium, and 2 surviving victims who said Derek had tried to reconnect with them in eerily identical ways. Still, without complete remains or direct confession, the jury hesitated. But a final envelope, opened post-arrest, contained a small bone, thread, and Natalie's wedding ring. It was enough. Derek Holloway was sentenced to life without parole. He died in 2018 from a ruptured intestine. No obituary, no visitors. Just 5 sealed case files, 87 spools of red thread, and the phrase he etched into the back of his cell desk: "Nothing bleeds like forgiveness." The breakthrough didn't come from a confession. It came from a drought. In the summer of 2006, 7 years after Natalie Reyes vanished, the lake behind Derek Holloway's farmhouse hit record low levels. What was once a broad, tranquil basin reduced to a cracked mud bed, revealing remnants of an old tractor, broken furniture, and something else. A clump of fabric tangled in roots, half submerged near a stone outcrop. A hiker spotted it, mistaking the red cloth for a forgotten picnic blanket. But closer inspection revealed something darker: frayed threads, claw marks, and what appeared to be human scalp tissue fused with degraded nylon. Forensics confirmed the worst. The fibers matched the red wool coat Natalie was last seen wearing, a gift from her mother. Traces of DNA survived, embedded in a bloodstain beneath the collar and in the lining. Fibers from a beige truck seat, identical to the upholstery in Derek Holloway's 1994 Ford F-150. It was the first piece of hard evidence to link him directly to her disappearance. Within days, authorities returned to Derek's property with a new warrant, this time targeting soil samples and deeper excavation of the garden he'd once obsessively tended. The roses had long since died, but underneath the roots were small, deliberate depressions in the soil, unnatural, symmetrical. Inside each one, plastic capsules the size of film canisters. They weren't hidden randomly. Each was wrapped in wax paper and sealed with colored thread. Inside, bone fragments. At least 5 capsules, each tagged with a date, scrawled in waterproof ink. They were markers, trophies, and they weren't all Natalie's. When questioned again, Derek didn't fight. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He sat in the interview room and talked about his tomatoes, how the soil needed turning before spring, how certain plants wouldn't grow if the drainage was off. When the investigator shifted the conversation to the capsules, Derek's eyes flicked once toward the mirrored glass, then back to the floor. He tapped his fingers in a pattern, 4 beats, then pause, then 2 more. They later learned he was mimicking a metronome, something he used in music therapy as a child. They asked about the women, about Natalie, about the bone dust. Derek didn't answer, but he smiled just once when they said the phrase "red coat." They never got a confession, but they didn't need one. The dental fragments in 2 of the capsules matched Natalie. Another contained pelvic bone consistent with a different missing woman, Layla Moss, a barista who disappeared in 2003 after rejecting a man who left flowers on her windshield. Derek had a library card from the same branch she visited the night she vanished. Her name was written in the margin of one of the gardening books found in his basement. The case was no longer about one missing woman. It was about pattern, intent, trophy storage, and Derek's precise surgical obsession with women who ignored him, ghosted him, or broke the illusion he built of intimacy where none existed. The prosecution leaned heavily on the physical evidence. They showed the jury the capsules, the matched fibers, the journal entry that mentioned tending the beds before winter, 5 mounds settled, 1 still loose. They called it a ledger of death, but Derek's defense played a different hand. No bodies, no murder weapon, no eyewitness, and Derek never once changed his story. He knew nothing, he remembered nothing. He was lonely, but not violent. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 5 days. On the 6th, they returned with a split verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder in the case of Natalie Reyes. Not guilty in the other charges due to lack of direct proof. He was sentenced to 38 years in prison. But the story didn't end in the courtroom. In 2014, during routine maintenance of a septic tank at the prison where Derek was held, a set of hollow plastic tubing was discovered inside the drainage filter, stuffed with more wax paper, more dates, and 1 small vertebrae. This time, the DNA was female, unknown. It reignited every dormant case file that ever bore Derek's shadow. But he never spoke. He died in 2017, reportedly of a stroke, though some say he'd stopped eating. His final drawing, found taped beneath his bunk, showed a rose bush with 6 petals. Inside each, the letter N. No one knows what it meant. The garden was paved over, The capsules remain in evidence storage, and Natalie's mother, now in her 70s, still leaves a single red rose at the edge of that dry lake bed each February. Derek Maddox never made headlines like Bundy or Dahmer, but to those who studied him, he represented a different kind of predator, not impulsive, not manic, but restrained, cold. A man who didn't need chaos to kill, just silence, soil, and time. And he wasn't the last. Because 300 miles away, in a storage unit behind a mini mall in Kentucky, a locksmith opened a rusted padlock in 1998 and uncovered something else. A folding table, a coil of rope, and a manila folder labeled "Wedding Files." What was inside would unravel a case of marital revenge unlike anything the state had seen, and reveal a groom whose idea of commitment came with burial instructions. He called himself Darren Bellamy, but that wasn't the name on his birth certificate or the one on the marriage license of the woman buried beneath the floorboards in Louisville. That name was Greg Langford, and in 1994 he legally vanished. Faked a motorbike crash, left a helmet filled with pig's blood near a guardrail on Route 7, and walked off into the woods with a duffel bag and an envelope of forged identity documents. 2 years later, he re-emerged as Darren, charming, middle-aged, and suddenly religious. But the Darren who showed up in Kentucky wasn't looking for salvation. He was planning weddings. Specifically, weddings that never reached the altar. Darren had a method. He joined grief support groups under aliases, often posing as a widower or cancer survivor. He'd strike up long emotional phone calls with women who were either recently divorced or who had themselves canceled engagements. Women in limbo, women with what-ifs lodged deep in their ribcages. His charm wasn't loud, it was soft, apologetic, understanding. He let them grieve, he let them feel heard. Then he offered them closure, redemption, and finally, a second chance at love. But the ceremonies he staged were one-sided. They involved folding tables, nylon ties, fake ivory veils, and silence. His victims weren't stabbed or shot. They were suffocated inside wedding dresses, their arms bound with floral ribbon, their mouths stuffed with bridal vow printouts. Then he'd vacuum seal them, like preserved bouquets, and file them behind false drywall in vacant rental properties he managed under shell companies. He called it his commitment catalog. Darren kept records, not journals or confessionals, but folders. Each folder labeled with a fake wedding name: Aaron and Darren, Stacy and Darren, Beth and Darren. Inside were RSVP cards, pressed pedals, and cassette tapes. Each tape contained pre-recorded vows he made his victims listen to, looped endlessly through a portable player while he conducted the ceremony. The audio always ended the same: "You're mine now, forever sealed." Police believe some of his victims were sedated before their final moments. Others likely begged. But Darren never raised his voice. He just read vows. What made him nearly impossible to catch was his use of intermittent timelines. He'd often wait years between killings, moving states, changing appearances slightly, and even creating fake alibis by mailing himself postcards from other cities during key dates. His final victim, a woman named Clarissa Danvers, was an elementary school librarian who'd just come out of a long, abusive relationship. Darren posed as a trauma counselor. They met at a bookstore, exchanged emails, and began rebuilding trust through nightly calls and handwritten letters. After 3 months, he proposed. Clarissa never told her family. She was embarrassed it had all happened so fast. But she left a voicemail the day she disappeared, tearful but excited, saying she was going to pick up her dress. She was never seen again. What cracked the case wasn't a body, it was a printer. Specifically, a misprinted save the date card Clarissa had thrown away weeks earlier. Her sister found it while cleaning her apartment and noticed the wedding location wasn't a church or venue. It was a street address tied to a storage unit registered under the name Marlowe Kendrick. Police obtained a warrant. Inside the unit, they found no body, but they found the table, the rope, the zip ties, and a whiteboard with dates, 5 of them, each marked sealed. Clarissa's date was the last. The handwriting matched postcards Darren had mailed to other victims' families, posing as them from across the country. Investigators cross-referenced storage unit records and uncovered 3 more units registered under different names, all linked to the same burner phone. In one of them, they finally found it, a sealed wall panel, inside which was a temperature-controlled chamber made from modified insulation and HVAC tubes. Inside, 3 vacuum-sealed bags. One contained Clarissa, perfectly preserved in a white gown, fake roses woven into her hair, her mouth taped shut beneath a sheer bridal veil. The 2 other bags held women missing from different states, Idaho and Ohio. Their identities matched cold cases from 1995 and 2001. Darren's prints were everywhere, but his real name, Greg Langford, took weeks to surface. They caught him by accident. He was applying for a landscaping license in a nearby county under the alias Dean Ramsey. His fingerprints pinged. When confronted, he didn't deny anything. He said only, "They knew what they were promising." In court, the prosecution revealed the most chilling detail. In each folder, inside the final pocket, was a Polaroid. Each victim photographed post-mortem, posed at the altar he built inside his storage unit, with Darren, in a tuxedo, holding their hand. The jury took 6 hours, life without parole. When asked why he kept the photos, he replied, "Because the ceremony didn't count unless there was proof." His folders are still held in evidence, each one labeled with love, each one a lie. The trial may have ended, but the catalog of Darren Bellamy, or Greg Langford, had only just begun to unravel. Forensic teams spent months tracing the movements of his shell companies, combing through property deeds, mailbox drop rentals, burner phones, and fake business cards scattered across 7 states. What they found was worse than anyone imagined. In one property alone, a derelict duplex in western Indiana, drywall panels had been painted over again and again. Beneath the layers, fragments of bridal lace were found, pressed into joint compound like fossils. One room had been wallpapered over completely with fake wedding invitations. On a shelf, they found a dozen cassette tapes labeled only with dates and initials. Each tape started the same, vows read slowly, calmly, by a man who never stumbled over his promises. On some, a woman's breathing could be heard in the background, fast, panicked, sometimes crying. On others, it was silent until the end, when the player clicked, rewound, and started again. Police believe he made the women listen on a loop while they sat bound in folding chairs, forced to absorb the fantasy as if it were real. Darren's ritual wasn't random, it was architected. He crafted every element to mimic tradition, but twisted it into a solitary theater of control. He didn't just kill, he staged. And in that staging, he became both groom and god, writing the script, choosing the ending, and sealing it in plastic like an eternal keepsake. The public was horrified, not just because of the murder, but because of the intimacy, the pretense of love. The wedding itself turned into a weapon. Psychological profilers noted Darren's obsessive need for preservation, not just of the body, but of the illusion. It wasn't about the act of violence. It was about control over the final image. That's why he took Polaroids, why he made custom vow booklets, why each folder included RSVP cards filled out with fake names, even ones marked declined. In one folder, they found a child's crayon drawing of a bride and groom. Investigators believe he drew it himself. But there was something even darker behind the logistics. When they pulled financial records, they discovered that Darren had used the victims' identities, post-mortem, to file tax returns, open store credit accounts, and even make charitable donations. One of the victims was listed as an annual donor to a local pet shelter for 6 years after her death. He'd even voted under one of their names in a city election. This wasn't just murder. It was sustained erasure and replacement. He didn't leave their bodies behind and flee. He left their lives running like ghost programs while he moved on to the next. It allowed him to disappear without suspicion. By the time someone realized the woman was missing, she'd already spoken through an email, or made a purchase online, or sent a holiday card. He kept their social profiles active. He'd even once responded to a message from a worried sibling with, "New beginnings. Don't worry." That was his language, always smiling, always closing the door with polite finality. When the evidence was finally presented in full, dozens of women, each with a signature Darren twist, the true scale emerged. The public dubbed him the Wedding Undertaker, but law enforcement gave him a colder designation, a template killer, meaning he repeated the same form, down to the smallest gesture, every time. That pattern made him terrifying, because any file left unfinished, any bride without a sealed folder, could mean an incomplete ritual, and incomplete rituals demanded resolution. In 2006, authorities reopened the case of a woman named Dana Culver, a florist from Arkansas who had gone missing on the eve of her second marriage. Her disappearance had never been linked to Darren. But after DNA from one of the storage unit dresses was cross-referenced, it matched a hair sample recovered from Dana's old apartment, one that had never belonged to her. Investigators revisited the guest list from her canceled wedding. There was one unfamiliar name on the list, Don Bellamy, a cousin, supposedly, but no one had ever met him. The email address he'd RSVP'd with had since been deleted, but in the recovered RSVP file from Darren's Indiana property, Dana's folder was there, marked C4, with her name written in perfect cursive. Inside, a pressed lily from her old flower shop. But her body was never found, and Darren refused to speak of her. When asked about Dana, he simply said, "She never got her bouquet. That was my fault." In 2015, while cleaning out Darren's final holding unit, one that had been mistakenly listed as delinquent on payments and nearly auctioned off, they found a new kind of file. This one was thicker, heavier, filled with documents from different identities, not just the brides, but the women who had supposedly refused him. Letters that had been returned, notes with, "I'm sorry, I don't feel the same." Some had been scrawled with ink in large X's. One, disturbingly, was written in childlike handwriting and signed by Auntie Clarissa. Experts believe these were his grievances, his emotional debts. Women who never made it into the ceremony. Women who, in his eyes, needed to be corrected, but hadn't yet been collected. It raised one horrific possibility, that the folders were not just records, but a waiting list. Darren Langford died of a brain hemorrhage in prison in 2018. He never gave a full confession, never revealed the total number of victims. His folders are still being processed. Some remain sealed because no family has come forward to claim the names within. Others contain pieces of women not yet identified. One folder was found with a blank name line and a Polaroid of an empty chair. The vow tape beside it played only static. But Darren wasn't the only man in America who used ritual as a disguise for murder. 4 states east, in a quiet community in Virginia, a different kind of romantic fantasy was curdling into a pattern of disappearances, one that didn't involve vows or veils, but letters, love letters, thousands of them, all addressed to the same man. They called him the Pen Pal Phantom. His real name was Elijah Crane, a soft-spoken postal clerk from Roanoke, Virginia, who lived in a split-level home with a hand-painted mailbox shaped like a heart. From the outside, Elijah looked like any other quiet bachelor, polite, punctual, invisible. But for nearly a decade, he ran a handwritten love letter operation so elaborate that it bordered on psychological warfare. His method was old-fashioned and unsettlingly pure. He wrote letters, dozens a week, sometimes hundreds. They weren't sent from one address. They were mailed from libraries, bus stations, tourist kiosks, even dropped into mailboxes out of town. He used vintage stamps, thick cotton paper, perfumed envelopes. Each letter was customized, long poetic lines, references to things women had posted online, phrases borrowed from their social media captions, hobbies lifted from old blog posts. He wasn't guessing, he was studying. He had files on women he'd never met, waitresses, Sunday school teachers, yoga instructors, women with small Etsy shops or public Pinterest boards. He built personalities for each alias he wrote from. Sometimes he was a soldier overseas, sometimes a widower, sometimes just a lonely stranger who found your website and had to write. Most of the letters went unanswered, but a few women replied. That's all he needed. Those who responded, even politely, entered the next phase: escalation. Elijah would change the tone, more vulnerable now, more direct. He'd reveal secrets, pretend he was battling depression, or claim he hadn't felt this way about anyone since his wife died. He used fake names: Marcus, Daniel, Luke. Each persona had its own email, handwriting, and backstory. And for the women who kept responding, a pattern emerged: the illusion of intimacy. He never pushed for photos, never asked to meet. That's what made him different. He wasn't rushing, he was weaving. One woman, Amelia Voss, received 86 letters over a 2-year period. She called it a friendship that felt like it came from a better time. Another woman, Talia Green, wrote in her journal that Luke's letters felt like therapy, like someone saw the softest parts of me and didn't flinch. But Luke didn't exist, and neither did the others. All of them were Elijah. And eventually, when the letters began to shift, when jealousy crept in or manipulation began, it was too late. By then, they trusted him, and that's when he took it offline. Elijah would follow them, not with aggression, but with gifts. Small tokens left on their porch or at their workplace, a pressed flower, a paper crane, a necklace mentioned once in passing. The first disappearance was dismissed as a fluke. A woman named Cassandra Poe, who'd told friends she was meeting a pen pal from out of state. Her car was found at a rest stop. Inside, a single envelope on the seat, no fingerprints. The second was Talia. Her apartment showed no signs of struggle. Her roommate thought she'd moved out early. Only later did police find a shoebox under her bed with 40 neatly tied letters signed Luke. When they traced the postmarks, they realized they weren't from California like he claimed. They were from rural Virginia. A librarian in Franklin County remembered Elijah. Quiet, kind, always requesting stationery with rose patterns. He used to write for hours at the corner table. The break came in 2013 when Amelia Voss, the woman who received 86 letters, went missing during a trip to deliver crafts to a local fair. Her friend reported her missing within 48 hours. Investigators, now aware of the pen pal pattern, recovered a voicemail from a burner number. It was a man sobbing, apologizing for ruining the wedding. Amelia wasn't engaged, but one of her letters had joked about planning a fantasy wedding with her mystery writer. The phrase stuck: ruining the wedding. That's when they raided Elijah Crane's home. Inside, they found an entire wall covered in corkboard with timelines, photographs, and maps. Red string connected locations, post offices, and women's faces. But it wasn't chaotic. It was organized like a postal routing system. Each woman had a file box. Some had diaries he'd stolen. Some had shoes. One box contained nothing but broken jewelry and petals, items believed to be trophies. The basement was worse. Beneath the concrete floor, cadaver dogs hid on 4 locations. The bodies were buried in sealed tubs, each with a set of letters and a dried bouquet. In one, investigators found the skeleton of Cassandra Poe, still wearing her ring, the same one her sister had gifted her before she vanished. Her hands were tied with pink ribbon. The ribbon had Elijah's DNA. In another tub, they found Talia's remains. A locket engraved with the name Luke was clutched in her left hand. The media exploded. The pen pal phantom was front-page news. People were horrified not just by the deaths, but by the time. Elijah had been operating undetected for over 10 years. There were no screams, no break-ins, no chases, just words, paper, ink, and patience. Experts called him a linguistic predator, a man who weaponized affection, who used love not to manipulate sex or money, but trust. His only desire was control, and his method was unmatched. He never made the same mistake twice. Every alias had a slightly different handwriting. Every woman had a different persona to attach to. He didn't just seduce, he tailored. During the trial, prosecutors read excerpts from his letters aloud. Some were breathtakingly romantic, others grew dark, even threatening. But Elijah never raised his voice. He sat quietly, hands folded as families cried. When asked why he did it, he said only, "They wanted to be seen. I saw them, that's all." He was convicted of 3 murders, with 2 additional charges pending based on DNA results. He's currently serving life without parole. But even now, investigators believe there may be more victims. More letters still floating in mailboxes, sent from aliases no one has connected to him yet. But the strangest piece of evidence came after sentencing. In his cell, Elijah requested a single item, a typewriter ribbon. Not a typewriter, just the ribbon. When asked why, he said, "Because sometimes the ink still remembers." His house was auctioned. The mailbox, shaped like a heart, was destroyed. But what Elijah left behind was more haunting than bones. It was the realization that some killers don't chase. They wait. They listen. They learn your favorite book and the name of your dog. And by the time you notice something is wrong, they already know how the story ends. But Elijah Crane wasn't the only man who weaponized romance. On the snowy roads of Montana, a different predator was waiting, not with poems or promises, but with a radio, a police badge, and a voice that every stranded woman wanted to trust. The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing Elijah Crane's world became. After the first 4 bodies were recovered from beneath the concrete in his basement, forensic teams began sifting through the rest of the property. The backyard, once manicured with meticulous hedges and creeping ivy, held more than soil. Beneath the garden arch where Elijah once displayed wind chimes and hanging flower pots, dogs alerted to human remains. What they unearthed were not full bodies, but curated remnants, jawbones, clavicles, pieces of pelvis, wrapped individually in wax cloth and buried at precise intervals, each marker indicated by a different species of flower planted above it. Lavender, daffodil, chrysanthemum. The plants weren't decorative, they were codes. Elijah, it turned out, had been keeping a floral index. In his garage, authorities found a handwritten book labeled Grief Garden. Each page corresponded to a flower type, a burial site, and a date. It was not only a ledger of death, it was a garden journal for his trophies. Some entries were annotated with initials, others had full names. Most were women never formally reported missing. The discovery of the Grief Garden notebook led to cross-referencing local disappearances with each floral clue. A woman named Brenna Hale, last seen in 2009 leaving a crafting expo, had once posted online about a bouquet of lavender she received anonymously. Another entry matched a woman named Darlene Shin, a high school art teacher who vanished in 2010. Her entry, "She liked chrysanthemums. Now she wears them." The implication was monstrous. Elijah wasn't just burying women. He was burying symbols of their affections, using their own preferences as grave markers. It was poetry turned necrotic, a floral language of control, grief, and godlike authorship. He wasn't content with murder. He wanted curation. Each grave was a tribute, a message, and a final, unreciprocated letter. The FBI's behavioral unit got involved next. One profiler noted Elijah's level of patience as serial-level stalking fused with antique courtship rituals. He didn't use modern tools, no dating apps, no video calls, no casual texting. Every step was handwritten, deliberate, analog. His postmarks were staggered by state. He used friends in neighboring towns to drop off letters under false names. He'd even once mailed a letter by hiding it inside a charity book donation box, which was later unpacked and mailed by volunteers, giving it an innocent trace. The scope of his operation was enormous for one man, but Elijah was meticulous. And his job at the Postal Service? Perfect cover. He knew mail routes, knew delays, knew how to make letters disappear. Even more horrifying, some of the letters were never mailed. Dozens were found inside his home addressed to women who never received them. Why? Investigators believe they were practice runs, drafts he never needed to send. Because for him, sometimes imagining the interaction was enough. The writing was both a lure and a ritual, but the physical evidence was what broke the case wide open. In a locked armoire inside his bedroom, investigators found a series of shoeboxes, each labeled with a fake name and filled with personal effects. A scarf with perfume residue, a book of pressed flowers with handwritten annotations, one woman's driver's license, long expired, never reported stolen. Beneath the boxes, a velvet-lined drawer holding teeth, 12 of them, cleaned, cataloged, and stored in labeled glass vials. Dental records matched 3 women who had gone missing between 2004 and 2012. The horror wasn't just in the killings, it was in the archiving. Elijah had turned each victim into a character, each possession into a paragraph, each death into a sentence that only he could read. Then came the revelation that broke the case into the national spotlight. A journalist from the Roanoke Ledger got hold of one of Elijah's letters, one sent to a woman who hadn't disappeared. Her name was Marie Hanford. She had saved every one of the letters, kept them in a binder. She had even met Elijah in person once, years earlier, believing he was a shy writer named Dale. When she saw his face on the news, she came forward. Her story changed everything. Marie hadn't fallen under his spell. She had seen red flags and cut ties after their coffee meeting. But Elijah kept sending letters, until one day they stopped. She thought he'd given up. But in the final letter, he'd written something chilling. Even silence is a kind of answer, and I always read between the lines. Marie's involvement helped prosecutors build a profile of who Elijah didn't kill, women who didn't fully submit, who kept boundaries, who questioned the illusion. It painted a psychological line. Elijah didn't attack random victims. He selected women who responded with empathy, women who tried to help, to comfort, to engage with what they thought was a broken man. He weaponized kindness, and he used their need to nurture as a wedge to insert himself into their lives. One psychologist on the case said, he wasn't seducing, he was collecting. The trial lasted nearly 8 months. The courtroom was packed every day. Journalists from all over the country reported on the poetic killer with the floral graves. Elijah sat silently for most of it, only occasionally raising his eyes when a letter was read aloud. During the closing statements, the prosecutor asked the court to imagine a man who didn't raise his voice, didn't carry a knife in public, didn't even touch his victims until the final moment. He kills with patience, she said, with pens, with petals, with promises. The jury took 4 days. The verdict: guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder, with additional charges pending. Elijah showed no emotion. Sentencing was swift, life without parole. He was remanded to a maximum security facility under suicide watch. But the story didn't end there. In 2022, a corrections officer found a thin sheet of notebook paper folded inside Elijah's mattress seam. It contained a list, not names, just dates, 32 of them, ranging from 2002 to 2021. Investigators believe they may correspond to other women whose families still don't know they're missing, or who were written off as runaways. The note was signed with a flower drawing, 6 petals, bleeding into each other, and the letter M in the center, Marie Hanford's initial. And then, something even stranger. A forensic linguist analyzing Elijah's old letters discovered an acrostic, a secret message formed by the first letter of each paragraph. One of the letters spelled out, "Find the guest book." Weeks later, a second search warrant was executed on Elijah's family's old vacation home in West Virginia. Inside a cedar chest in the attic, they found it. A small guest book, like the kind you'd find at a funeral or bed and breakfast. Inside, 12 names, 12 signatures, all written in different handwriting, all fake, except one, Amelia Voss. The entry was dated 3 days before she disappeared. Today, the pen pal Phantom's letters are still used in criminal psychology courses. His case reshaped how online emotional grooming is viewed, not as mere manipulation, but as predatory architecture. He didn't chase victims through alleys. He waited for them to open the door, thinking they were inviting in warmth, connection, healing. But they were letting in silence, and the silence had a name. But Elijah Crane wasn't the only one who weaponized trust. Some predators wear loneliness like armor. Others wear charm like a costume. And one groom used his wedding vows as the first line of a death sentence. They called him the Vow Keeper, but not because he honored his promises. Quite the opposite. Kenneth Vale was a man who saw commitment as ownership, not partnership. In photographs, he looked like the textbook husband, clean-shaven, suited, standing tall beside blushing brides. But behind every picture was a plan, a ritual, a checklist. Because for Kenneth, marriage was never about love. It was about control. It was a trap that ended in silence. Before he was a suspect, before anyone connected the dots, Kenneth was a man who slipped easily through life. He worked at an upscale catering business in Ohio, known for his impeccable event coordination skills. He specialized in weddings. That's where he met most of his victims, smiling across champagne towers, folding napkins beside bridesmaids, offering last-minute help that felt God-sent to stressed-out couples. He was helpful, gentle, the kind of man who remembered everyone's name and left behind thank you cards. And he had a rule: never strike too soon. Kenneth's pattern started slow. He'd charm a bride during a job, then reconnect weeks later with an innocuous message. "Hey, I found your bracelet from the reception," or "just wanted to make sure the wedding photos turned out okay." From there it became coffee, then dinners, then engagement, then a rushed wedding in a remote county with no friends, no family. He always insisted on elopements. Less stress, more intimacy, he'd say. But really, it was isolation, a way to keep eyes away. And then, months later, the bride would vanish. Not suddenly, gradually. A missed holiday party, a canceled social media account, a new voicemail saying she was traveling. But friends always felt something was off. They just didn't have proof. The first case that hinted at something wrong was Amanda Rister, a florist from Toledo. She married Kenneth in 2013 after a whirlwind 2-month courtship. Her family never met him. She told her sister they were planning a move to Montana. She never arrived. Instead, a postcard arrived 3 weeks later, a photo of the Rocky Mountains, no return address, and a brief message. "The stars are beautiful here. We're happy." But Amanda's sister said something was wrong. The handwriting wasn't Amanda's, and Amanda hated postcards. It was a subtle detail, but it lingered. Years later, when investigators compared that postcard to others found in Kenneth's belongings, they confirmed it. He had forged it. He was mimicking his wife's voice, even her phrasing, in an effort to keep up the illusion. Amanda's body was never found, but in a crawl space beneath a cabin Kenneth once rented, cadaver dogs signaled. The soil had been disturbed. Traces of bone dust and hair consistent with Amanda's DNA were found, but not enough to confirm death. The case was ruled suspicious, but without a body, Kenneth walked, and he did it again. His next bride was Talia Doon, a makeup artist from Akron. Same pattern: whirlwind courtship, rushed marriage, total isolation. This time, Kenneth took her to a lake house in upstate New York. Neighbors said they were quiet, polite, always seen holding hands. But one day, she disappeared. Kenneth claimed she'd gone back to care for her sick mother. But her mother had been dead for years. Suspicion mounted, but again, no body, no crime. What finally broke the pattern was a woman named Josie Nara, his last known bride, who fought back. Josie had grown up around narcissists. Her radar was sharp. She sensed early on that something was wrong, the way Kenneth controlled their finances, how he refused to let her speak privately to friends, how he insisted she wear a fitness tracker for safety. She played along, pretended to fall deeper. She waited until the night he brought up moving to a place where no one can find us. That's when she ran. She escaped through a bathroom window, barefoot, with the GPS watch stuffed in a towel to make it seem like she was asleep. She made it to a neighbor's farm, called 911, and Kenneth was arrested that night. The search of his property revealed everything. Inside the barn were suitcases, each one labeled with initials that didn't match any living person in his circle. Inside, wedding dresses, journals, scrapbooks. One bag held a sealed box of teeth. Another, a diary belonging to Amanda Rister. The pages stopped abruptly on a line that read, "He says I talk too much. Maybe I do." It was the last thing she ever wrote. When Josie testified in court, she said Kenneth saw marriage as a hunt. He didn't want a wife, she said. He wanted a memory, something he could fold and put away when he was done. Kenneth Vale was charged with 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and multiple counts of evidence tampering. During his trial, prosecutors described him as a man who turned romance into ransom. He showed no remorse. Even during sentencing, he simply smiled and said, "They said, 'Till death do us part.' I kept my promise." He was sentenced to life without parole. Today, Josie runs a nonprofit for survivors of coercive control. Kenneth remains in a maximum security facility in Indiana, where he is not allowed access to mail, writing utensils, or visitors. He has reportedly requested books on Victorian courtship. All requests were denied. The unraveling of Kenneth Vale's double life began, ironically, with an act of compassion. A young widow named Dana Kessler, whose husband had died in a workplace explosion, attended one of Vale's grief seminars in the spring of 1999. She sat in the back, arms crossed, wary but quiet, and noticed 2 things no one else did. 1, that Vale never took notes despite offering personalized follow-ups to attendees. And 2, that he wore a specific silver ring on his pinky finger, which bore an inscription she recognized from a prayer card left in her mailbox 3 weeks earlier, unsigned, anonymous, and unsettling. The coincidence triggered suspicion, but it wasn't until she mentioned the card to her friend, a local librarian, that anything moved forward. That friend, curious, ran a basic keyword search through the microfiche obituary index at the city archives and discovered something strange. Vale's name, listed as a grief facilitator, appeared in connection with 3 separate memorial events over the last 4 years, each involving a young woman between 25 and 35, all of whom were listed as having died by self-inflicted injury or undetermined circumstances within 8 weeks of losing their spouse. There was no direct connection yet, just smoke. But in true crime, smoke with precision often means fire. The librarian flagged the pattern to a retired detective she knew casually, who was volunteering with a local victims advocacy group. He passed it to a contact still active in missing persons, who ran a deeper cross-check across state lines. That's when the real picture started forming. Vale had registered in multiple grief counseling workshops from 1992 to 1998 across 5 states. He operated under slight variations of his name: Ken V, K.R. Vale, Dr. Kenneth Vale, none of which were formally credentialed. He rented mailboxes. He used calling cards. He operated through payphones. His appointment books were handwritten and burned quarterly, a habit he reportedly justified to friends as minimalism. But the one thing he couldn't erase was his fondness for analog tape. In his private life, he collected voice recordings obsessively, grief voicemails, late-night calls to hotlines, saved messages from the answering machines of women he targeted. When police executed a warrant on his storage unit in Nevada, they found not only the wedding files but a cassette player built into the wall with labeled drawers beneath it. Each drawer had a name, not the real name of the woman but Vale's pet name for her: June, Little Clove, Blue House. Inside each, 1 or 2 tapes, neatly labeled, and a single object: a trinket, sometimes a ribbon, a napkin, a button, once a lock of hair secured in wax. Vale had created a sound library of his victims, cataloging their pain in real time, then disposing of the women after what he called the release ceremony. According to experts brought in later, his process was neither sexual nor spontaneous. It was liturgical. He reenacted the death of intimacy as a ritual of silence. No blood, no loud violence, just suffocation by plastic wrap, quiet music in the background, a folded note placed on the chest, and one posed photograph, always seated, always in front of a black curtain. The bodies were not buried but sealed, placed in drywall compartments within abandoned buildings, covered with insulation and fake permit notices, timed to look like stalled renovations. In one case, he painted a wall to match a fast food kitchen just days before it was demolished. The bodies were never found, but the residue remained. The trial of Kenneth Vale became a war of paper versus silence. He refused counsel at first. When questioned, he neither admitted nor denied. He simply responded to inquiries by reading eulogies he'd written for the victims, detached, soft-spoken, written in second person, as if addressing them from a distance beyond time. The prosecution relied heavily on the audio tapes and material evidence, fibers from the women's clothing, handwriting matches, and metadata traced from library computers he used to draft anonymous letters. But they lacked physical remains. Without the bodies, they needed intent. The defining break came from an unexpected source: a used bookstore owner who recognized one of the wedding folders from a photo released to the media. She remembered Vale, quiet, always looking for books on embalming, mourning customs, and funeral architecture. She still had his order history, which included detailed blueprints for 1940s mortuary walls and a dissection guide on post-mortem body folding. With this, the prosecution created a profile: not a killer driven by lust, but by ceremony. A man who built his life around the controlled dismantling of love, manipulating the rituals of grief to reset emotional power in his favor. His victims were never random. Each had ended something: a relationship, an engagement, a betrayal. And Vale, believing himself the officiator of closure, gave them a perverse kind of wedding, one they would never leave. The jury convicted Vale on 13 counts of premeditated murder based on circumstantial evidence, matched handwriting, and the tapes. No parole, 9 life sentences. But no victim's body was ever fully recovered. Vale never confessed, never reacted. His final words before sentencing were a whisper: caught only by the stenographer. They never said goodbye. In his prison cell, guards reported that he spent hours sitting upright, staring at the wall, mouthing phrases in rhythm with an unseen metronome. When his cell was cleared after his death in 2006 from a stroke, same as Derek Maddox, officers found a final letter under the mattress. It read simply, "The curtain never falls, it folds." Some monsters crave attention. These 5 thrived in the quiet, burying truth beneath gardens, vows, lake beds, and lullabies. They didn't just kill for revenge, they choreographed it. And long after their names faded, the echoes of their cruelty still whisper in missing persons folders no one dares reopen.